What if I told you that the tree decorating your living room this Christmas contains 5 times more vitamin C than oranges? That its needles can cure diseases that kill millions? That for 10,000 years it was the most powerful winter pharmacy in North America, saving lives when everything else failed? And then, in less than 2 centuries, we erased that knowledge so completely that today we spend billions on synthetic supplements while ignoring the remedy growing freely in our yards. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented history. This is verified science. And it is a crime against human knowledge so massive that it changed the course of medicine forever. Welcome to Forgotten Soil Wisdom. Before we unearth this truth, if these stories matter to you, the best way to preserve this wisdom is simple. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this knowledge with those who need to remember what we forgot. The story begins in the winter of 1535 on the frozen shores of the St. Lawrence River, where Quebec City stands today. A French expedition led by Jacques Cartier is trapped by ice. Their 3 ships are frozen in the harbor. They cannot leave until spring. What begins as a logistical setback quickly becomes a death sentence. By mid-February 1536, nearly the entire crew is dying. Their legs swell grotesquely. Their arms are covered in dark purple spots. Their gums rot, exposing teeth that then fall out one by one. Their skin opens into sores that will not heal. The men bleed internally. They spit blood. Their bones become so brittle they break with the slightest movement. This is not a quick death. It is an agony that drags on for weeks. Cartier calls it scorbut in his journal. Today we know it as scurvy, the disease of vitamin C deficiency. Without vitamin C, the human body cannot produce collagen, the protein that holds your tissues together. You literally fall apart from the inside. It is one of the most horrible deaths imaginable. And of the 112 sailors trapped in that Canadian winter, 100 of them are dying. Cartier is desperate. Europeans have no cure for scurvy. They don't understand what causes it. They don't know that fresh fruits and vegetables could save them. They are doomed. But the indigenous people living nearby, the Iroquois, observe this suffering, and they know the cure. They have known it for thousands of years. One day, a chief named Domagaya approaches the French camp. He himself had suffered from scurvy the year before. Now he is completely healthy. He shows them a tree. They call it Aneda. The French translate it as the tree of life and as Arbre de vie. Domagaya teaches them how to harvest its needles and bark, boil them in water, and drink the resulting tea. The French sailors, with no other options, obey. What happens next defies everything. Europeans believe they know about medicine. Within days, the symptoms begin to reverse. The gums stop bleeding. The sores start to heal. The swelling decreases. Men who were too weak to get out of their bunks regain their strength. By May, when the ice finally melts, 87 sailors are healthy enough to sail back to France. 25 had died before the indigenous people shared their knowledge. Those 25 men died unnecessarily, not for lack of a cure, but from European ignorance of a medicine that had existed right under their noses the entire time. Cartier documents this miracle in his journal. The news reaches Europe, and then, incredibly, Europe forgets, ignores, dismisses. For the next 200 years, tens of thousands of European sailors will die from scurvy on long voyages. The British Navy will not officially adopt lime juice as a preventive until 1795, more than 250 years after the Iroquois showed the French the cure. A quarter of a millennium of unnecessary deaths because Europe refused to learn from the savages. But this story does not begin with the Europeans. It begins 10,000 years earlier, with peoples who understood the forest in ways that modern science is only beginning to recognize. For the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois people, the eastern white pine was not just a tree. It was Skinatati, the tree of peace, the living symbol of their five-nation confederacy. Under its branches, they buried their weapons. In its shade, they made treaties. And from its needles, they made the medicine that kept them alive through the brutal northeastern winters. The Ojibwa called it Jingwak. The Chippewa revered its resin as a sacred cure for infections and gangrene. The Algonquin prepared teas from its needles to prevent disease during the months when the earth was frozen and no fresh fruits or vegetables were available. These were not primitive superstitions. This was sophisticated pharmacology perfected over millennia. Each tribe had their methods. Some harvested only the young, tender needles of spring. Others preferred the older needles from inside the tree, instinctively knowing what modern science would confirm centuries later, that older needles contain higher concentrations of medicinal compounds. Some prepared teas by boiling the needles for hours. Others made cold infusions, soaking the needles in water for days. Some mixed the inner bark with the needles for a more potent medicine. They knew that different trees had different potencies. Balsam fir, which they called Ininaatik, was especially valued. White cedar, Gijik, was another favorite. Each species had its own medicinal profile, its own spirit, its own way of healing. This knowledge was as fundamental to their survival as knowing how to hunt or make fire. It was the difference between living and dying when winter turned the land into a white desert. And it wasn't just about preventing scurvy. Pine needle teas treated coughs and chest congestion. They relieved fever. They reduced inflammation. They accelerated wound healing when applied externally. The vapors from boiling needles opened the lungs and cleared the sinuses. The sticky resin from the tree sealed cuts and fought infections. Every part of the tree was a tool in their medical arsenal. Mothers fed sick children small amounts of needle tea sweetened with maple syrup. Elders drank it daily during winter to maintain their strength. Warriors carried dried resin on their journeys, ready to be applied to wounds. Healers spent years learning the details, which species to use, which parts to harvest, when to harvest them, how to prepare them, what doses to administer. This was professional medical knowledge of the highest level. When the Europeans arrived, they brought diseases that devastated native populations. But they also brought ignorance. Ignorance of the land, ignorance of its resources, ignorance of the peoples who had thrived here for 10,000 years. And when the Iroquois saved Cartier's crew with the Tree of Life tea, they offered Europe a key to an entire pharmacy. Europe took that key and threw it in the river. Now let's talk about why it worked. This is not magic. It is biochemistry, and the numbers are astonishing. In the 1940s, the USDA Forest Service finally analyzed what native peoples had been using for millennia. What they found should have revolutionized medicine. It should have been on the cover of every medical journal. Instead, the findings are buried in obscure research papers that almost no one reads. Balsam fir, Abies balsama, the same tree that probably saved Cartier's crew, contains 270 milligrams of vitamin C per 100 grams of fresh needles. Let me put that in perspective. An orange, the universal symbol of vitamin C, the fruit that doctors recommend for immune health, contains 53.2 milligrams per 100 grams. Balsam fir has 5 times more vitamin C than an orange. Red spruce, Picea rubens, contains 169 milligrams per 100 grams. That is more than triple an orange. Even eastern white pine, Pinus strobus, known as the tree of peace of the Iroquois, has variable concentrations depending on which part you use. Young needles have about 32 milligrams, similar to an orange, but the inner bark of white pine contains 200 milligrams, almost 4 times more than an orange. And here is the detail that native peoples understood instinctively. Vitamin C content increases with needle age. The new tender needles of spring have the lowest concentration. 1-year-old needles have double. 2-year-old needles, the dark, tough needles from inside the tree that most people would throw away, have 3.5 times more vitamin C than a fresh orange. The elders who taught younger generations to harvest from the right tree at the right time of year using needles of the right age were not following meaningless rituals. They were practicing precision medicine. They were maximizing potency. They were doing exactly what a modern pharmacist would do, optimizing dosage. But vitamin C is just the beginning. Modern analysis reveals that conifer needles contain a complete pharmacy of bioactive compounds. They contain vitamin A, essential for vision, skin, and immune function. They contain polyphenols, powerful antioxidants that protect cells from damage. They contain terpenes, the aromatic compounds that give pines their characteristic smell, which have documented anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial effects. They contain shikimic acid, the same compound that the pharmaceutical industry extracts to manufacture Tamiflu, the world's best-selling antiviral drug. They contain proanthocyanidins, compounds that strengthen blood vessels and improve circulation. They contain essential oils with antiseptic properties, so potent they have been used to preserve food and mummies. Modern research confirms what native tribes described for centuries. Pine needle teas have expectorant effects. They loosen mucus and facilitate the expulsion of phlegm from the lungs. They have bronchodilator effects. They open airways and make breathing easier. That is why steam inhalers with pine needles were a standard treatment for colds and flu. Compounds from pine needles also act as mild diuretics. They stimulate the kidneys, increase urine production, and help the body eliminate toxins. The Chippewa used needle tea specifically to cleanse the system when someone was sick, understanding that helping the body eliminate waste speeds recovery. Pine resin, the sticky sap that hardens on the bark, was especially revered. The Chippewa applied it directly to infected wounds, to burns, and to cases of gangrene. Modern science explains why pine resin contains abietic acid and other resinous acids that have powerful antimicrobial properties. It literally kills bacteria on contact. It was a natural antibiotic ointment centuries before Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin. Studies also show that compounds from pine needles strengthen capillary walls, reducing blood vessel fragility. This is exactly what scurvy destroys, the integrity of your blood vessels. Pine needle tea does not just prevent scurvy by providing vitamin C. It provides cofactors that optimize vascular function. It is full-spectrum medicine of a complexity that no laboratory has replicated. So if this knowledge was so powerful, if science has verified it, if it worked for 10,000 years, why doesn't your doctor know anything about this? Why isn't there pine needle tea in pharmacies next to synthetic vitamin C tablets? Why did this medicine save Europeans in 1536 but was forgotten by 1800? The answer is simple, brutal, and reveals everything about how modern medicine really works. You cannot patent a tree. In the early 19th century, European medicine was in crisis. Doctors still use bloodletting and mercurial purges. Mortality rates in hospitals were terrifying, but something was changing. Chemists were learning to isolate active compounds from plants. In 1804, Friedrich Schirner isolated morphine from opium. In 1820, quinine was extracted from cinchona bark. In 1828, salicin was purified from white willow, eventually leading to aspirin. These discoveries revolutionized medicine. For the first time, doctors could administer precise doses of powerful compounds. But they also created a new business model. An isolated compound, especially one synthesized in a laboratory, could be patented. A patent meant monopoly. A monopoly meant massive profits. A tree growing freely in the forest, used by anyone who knew which parts to harvest, could not be patented. It could not be monopolized. It could not generate the fortunes that synthetic compounds promised. And so began a systematic campaign, often unconscious, but devastatingly effective, to discredit what was called folk or folkloric medicine. Medical schools, increasingly aligned with pharmaceutical companies, began teaching that only purified compounds were real medicine. Complex plant mixtures were rejected as unscientific. Indigenous knowledge was dismissed as superstition. Traditional remedies were labeled as quack cures. By the early 20th century, the 1910 Flexner Report virtually eradicated herbal and eclectic medical schools in the United States, consolidating control of medicine under the allopathic pharmaceutical model. Native knowledge suffered even worse. Indian residential schools, which operated from the 1870s to the 1970s, explicitly banned traditional medical practices. Native children were punished for speaking their languages, practicing their rituals, or using their medicines. Healers were arrested. Sacred knowledge was suppressed. Entire generations grew up disconnected from the wisdom of their ancestors. At the same time, the pharmaceutical industry shamelessly exploited indigenous knowledge. Companies studied native medicinal plants, isolated their active compounds, patented them, and sold synthetic versions at huge profits, while denying any debt to the peoples who had preserved that knowledge for millennia. Shikimic acid from pine needles became Tamiflu, and it generates billions of dollars annually. The native peoples who used pine needles for centuries saw not a cent. The tragedy runs deep because the single compound approach often fails where traditional full-spectrum remedies succeed. Synthetic vitamin C alone does not fully replicate the effects of pine needle tea because the needles contain cofactors, bioflavonoids, vitamin A, and terpenes, which work synergistically with vitamin C. It is like comparing a single musical instrument to a full orchestra. Both make music, but the complexity and depth are completely different. Modern research confirms this repeatedly. Whole plant extracts often outperform isolated compounds in clinical trials. The complete turmeric complex works better than isolated curcumin. Whole garlic beats pure allicin. Complete willow bark is gentler on the stomach than synthetic aspirin. Nature has already done the optimization work over millions of years of evolution, but that knowledge does not generate patentable profits. Today, the global pharmaceutical industry is worth more than $1.5 trillion annually. Americans spend hundreds of dollars a year on vitamin C supplements, most synthesized from genetically modified corn in Chinese factories. We buy multivitamin complexes with 30 different ingredients, trying to replicate what a single cup of pine needle tea provides naturally. And meanwhile, the tree of life that saved Cartier's crew grows freely in yards, parks, and forests throughout North America. Millions of people have a fir, pine, or spruce decorating their living rooms every December. not knowing they are looking at a pharmacy. Children play under its branches. People sweep up its fallen needles and throw them in the trash. We have forgotten so completely that Christmas tree medicine is now invisible, even when it is right in front of us. But the knowledge is not completely dead. It survives in native communities that never completely gave up. It survives in herbal texts published by brave authors who refuse to let it disappear. It survives in internet forums where people rediscover forgotten remedies. And it survives in forests where trees continue offering their gifts, patiently waiting for humans to remember. If you want to reconnect with this wisdom, here is what you need to know. First, identification is critical. Not all conifers are safe. Yew taxus is highly toxic. Norfolk Island pine, common as an ornamental Christmas tree, is not medicinal. You need to correctly identify the species. Balsam fir, red spruce, eastern white pine, or northern white cedar are the safest and most potent. Harvest needles from healthy trees away from roads where exhaust fumes could contaminate them. Older needles from inside the tree have higher medicinal content than new tips. Rinse the needles to remove any residue or dust. To make tea, use approximately a handful of chopped needles per cup of hot water. Do not boil the needles because excessive heat destroys vitamin C. Steep for 10 to 15 minutes. Strain and drink. The taste is resinous, slightly bitter, with citrus notes. Some people add honey or maple syrup, just as native peoples did. Start with small amounts to make sure you do not have sensitivity. Pregnant women should avoid it because some compounds can stimulate contractions. And always consult with a healthcare professional, especially if you have medical conditions or take medications. This is not a call to abandon modern medicine. Antibiotics save lives. Surgeries save lives. Vaccines save lives. But this is a call to recognize that we have recklessly discarded knowledge that also saved lives. It is a call to question a system that marginalizes any medicine that cannot be patented and commodified. It is a call to remember that for 10,000 years, humans thrived using what the earth freely provided. The next time you see a Christmas tree, remember, you are looking at the tree of peace, of the Haudenosaunee. You are looking at the tree of life that saved Cartier's crew. You are looking at a pharmacy that contains more vitamin C than oranges, more healing compounds than any multivitamin, more wisdom than any pharmacology textbook. You are looking at 10,000 years of medical knowledge growing silently, waiting for us to remember. The knowledge never died. It was silenced. It was marginalized. It was buried under mountains of corporate propaganda and medical arrogance. But it survived. And now that you know, you cannot forget. Every pine needle you see is a reminder. Every evergreen tree in the forest is a library. The forgotten pharmacy of winter never closed. We simply stopped visiting. If this wisdom awakens something in you, subscribe to Forgotten Soil Wisdom and hit the bell. Every like and every time you share helps protect knowledge that the world tried to erase. The next secret will be unearthed soon, revealing another truth that corporations hoped you would never discover.